Hi, I'm Nanci France-Vaz. Welcome to my studio. Today I'll be going over how I clean my various rosemary brushes, and I do use a lot of different brushes because I primarily paint figurative in the environment, either outdoor or indoor. So there's landscape, or there's an interior to paint, and sometimes it's abstracted with gold leaf and different other surfaces. So depending on what type of painting I'm doing and the surface I'm working on, I use a different brush. Therefore, if I'm using a medium, I will clean my brushes totally different than if I'm not using a medium. Certain mediums I use will make the brushes a little bit harder, so they need to be cleaned right away. So here's a couple of ideas I have and what works for me. I have this Creative Mark brush holder. And I do have a brush already in there with a few dirty brushes here, just to show you how it works. Basically, what you do, any brushes that you use, you hang them upside down and you can leave them in the oil, either canola oil, it could be corn oil, they're cheap. I use walnut oil, but that could be expensive over time, so you may want to alternate. And what I like about that is I don't have to clean them all the time. If you're painting with no medium or a very light medium, not too much medium, you can use this method. If you're using a heavy-duty medium, like some people use Venetian turpentine or Damar varnish in their medium, the thing that I don't like is if you clean your brushes in this, you would then have to get another canister like this, brush washer, and put your brushes in that oil. So now you have two different cans of oil happening, which I don't like that. I would rather just have one and then clean the oil out by spilling it in a pail and dispose it where you need to dispose it. So this one can hold 10 to 15 brushes in here. So if you use a lot of brushes, usually I use about 20 brushes minimum. When I'm painting for large, small, medium, it doesn't matter. I'm always wanting to have a clean brush. So I have to remember that I have my brushes lying around. So what I do to remember that is put them in a can on the side or something like this, an old pretzel jar of my husband's. He gave it to me. And so for bigger brushes, I'll put them in there. And this is the dirty brushes that I'm using. And I remember to clean them. I know a lot of us don't remember, so especially after a day of painting, so I just make sure that I remember that. So let me go over method one of how I do this. So here, as you can see, that's what the inside of the Creative Mark brush washer looks like. And with this brush that I already have in here, that's full of paint, you can see all the paint coming off. The walnut oil that I use is this walnut alkyd medium, but it's just walnut oil, and it will get all of the pigment out using my shop towel. I love these towels. If you don't have these, they sell them at Home Depot or any hardware store. They're slightly more expensive than the Viva that I used to use, but these are lint-free, and all the pigment comes out unbelievable in these. So you just go back and forth, dip the brush in again, swish it around. And if I turn this over, let's see if any more pigment. Hardly any pigment on that. And I'm very careful. You don't want to pull it too hard, but hard enough where now you have, look at that, razor sharp edge. Some of you complain about the rosemary brush, the filberts and the flats in the Ivory collection. So this is one that I have for quite a few years. What I do at the end, after I clean them, if you use the oil, that won't happen. It's if pigment gets stuck in the brush, it dries the brush out, and then that'll happen. The other thing is, if you hang them right side up, the ferrule will get ruined, and all whatever's in there, if you didn't clean the brush well enough, it'll just build up at the bottom here, the pigment, and it'll cause the brush to flay out. What I usually do is lie them flat, like this, or I will hang them upside down so that all the water goes out. But you notice with the oil, there is nothing, I mean, no fraying, zero. This is an Eclipse long flat. I use these a lot, and I use a lot of the filberts. If you don't want to clean them all the time, this is a great way to clean the brushes, save them. And then what I do is once a week, I will use Jack's Linseed Soap. This is a Jack Richardson product. The Studio Soap is non-toxic and it's a low odor. Open this up. This is a new one, right? And it has linseed oil in there with a soap. Now, it's very similar to Murphy's oil soap, and I used to use Murphy's oil, but I found it didn't clean the brushes well enough. So I will take you to my downstairs studio with my second method, which is also using turpentine. So again, let's go over that again. I will just get the brush. Now, reds are even worse. Now, this is a long ivory filbert, one of my favorite. And it's a few years old. I think this brush is about 2 years old. I could tell by the handle, the type is starting to wear off. So I could usually tell that I held the brush a lot by then. And you see all the pigments coming off. I'm going to turn the shop towel around again. Look. Magic. It's coming off. I'm not going to have a dirty brush. And there you go. Here is the ivory filbert flat, razor sharp. And I don't know about you, but I absolutely need edges like that. I am somewhat between a loose and a tight painter. It all depends on what I'm painting. So having these brushes like this is very important. You could then go in with turpentine, and I do have a brush holder here. That has Gamsol odorless mineral spirits. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll rinse my brush out. The brush with turp. I'll get most of the pigment out so that I don't have that much. And this is an Eclipse filbert now that I'm using, and I use those too. I love these, the flats and the filberts in the Eclipse line. They're my favorite. They hold a really great edge, but they're not for blocking in. I usually use the filbert, ivory filbert or ivory flat collection for those. I'll then go in with my walnut oil or corn oil, whatever you're using, and make sure, look, more is coming out. Until you don't see any more pigment. Now, what I'll do is I'll just leave the brush now that there isn't any pigment left, and I'll leave the brush upside down. So that's one method with the Creative Mark brush washer, and you can do it. It doesn't have to be by Creative Mark. I like it because it was cheap, so I wanted to try it. I had another system at one time that was gigantic, and it was a nightmare. I rather keep it simple, small. We have enough clutter in our studio. Why clutter it more? I think this was like $8 on Jerry's Autorama. You can pick it up. And what I like is you can hang a lot of brushes on this, and I usually use size 10, 8, 4, 6, all the way down to zeros. I'm able to keep them upside down. Nothing's getting in the ferrule. It doesn't destroy the brush. The oil really cleans it out. If you use the turpentine first, there's certain pigments I find that I have to use the Gamsol first because it doesn't fully come out as if I didn't use it at all and then use the oil. Sometimes I'll put the oil, and then when I go in with the turpentine, more comes out. So like the reds, some like Indian red, some of the earth pigments that are very infectious, dioxazine purple, those colors tend to hold a lot more pigment in the brush, and you have to clean them right, because if you don't, let's see, do I have a brush in here? These are all my rosemary brushes, by the way, that I've collected over the years, and some of them are 4 or 5 years old. So there were, I don't know if I could find it. There's a couple of brushes that I actually ruined because I forgot to clean them out. Let's see. Nope, not that one. Maybe. This is an old bristle of hers. It just got very hard. So if that happens, what I do is I use it for hair, or I use it for grass, or, you know, something like creative, like when I did my husband Tim's painting. You know, I kind of went in with those brushes that were dried out, frayed. They were kind of damaged. I don't throw them away. I keep them because you never know. Another tool in your toolbox can get a certain effect that you like. So that's what I use on the back of these. I use a lot of Eclipse combers, dry painted, palette knife, then go back in with a brush. I can drip paint. Now, a lot of times I'm using a lot of medium for that because I want a certain effect. When you're using a lot of mediums, you have to really make sure you clean your brushes well. If you don't, and you leave them around, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble, and you'll start spending money on new brushes. So here I am in my downstairs studio, and I was really lucky when we got this house. For once, it had a slop sink. I was always distressing over cleaning my brushes out in my sink back in my other house because it would clog the pipes. And so that's how I started with doing my brushes with oil, so I wouldn't have to worry about that. In this house, I don't have to worry about it. So let's take a brush that I had in the oil, and I use hot water here. And what I do is I dip it in my studio soap. And I just make a lot of circles with a little pressure on my hand. I have hot water running, and then I put it under the water. And what I'll do a lot of times is I'll have a paper towel down here, but if I don't and I forget, I just make sure on the black glove that I don't see any pigment. If I don't, then I know it's clean. If it's not, I just dip it back in the studio soap, and I give it a second cleaning just to make sure all the pigment is out. Put it back under the sink, the hot water. It gets everything out. And I line them up on this sculpture stand here. And I just keep them flat. Bring my oil back upstairs, or sometimes I keep it down here if I'm painting down here. But all my brushes are basically flat on this, and I let them dry overnight. And that's it. So here's a painting I just finished, and I'll go over a few of the brushes that I used on this painting so you get an idea of how I work and some of the rosemary brushes I use. Many people ask me about how I paint hair. So first of all, when I first block in hair, I use the Eclipse comber, and I will use a comber or an Eclipse filbert or flat to do these. This is the difference. So here is the Eclipse filbert long. I always use the long. This is another Eclipse brush, but it has a cat's tongue. And this one is the comber. So when I block hair in, I'll go with the combers because they're softer, and I lay in all the shadow shapes. And I don't just use, this one is a size 1/4 inch. I use the 1/2 inch and the 1 inch to block in big areas. I don't use small brushes until I need it for smaller detail. But basically I'm using a 4, 6, or 8, and sometimes 10 to block in the painting. Let's say on this it's a 24 by 30. If I'm using a bigger painting, I'm going in with these. These are 10s and 12s that I use. And I actually have a much bigger brush that I can wash in with by Rosemary. I also use these to knock down my background, or when I'm doing hair, if I want to get out the edge, I can just get the edge out, and this is the medium-sized Badger Fan Series, number 37. Now, my favorite, once I have the hair blocked in and the values work out, I want to now put the detail of the hair in. So I have the sables and one synthetic, and this is a Shiraz sword. And I love this for getting these loose strands. In this instance, her hair was just straight. There wasn't any wind blowing, and I had to make it up, see it in my head. So I just imagined what the hair would be like blowing in the wind. And I went in with my sword liner, and I used the tip for smaller, thinner, and then this whole thing that will fray, like think of combing hair, to pull out. And I have 3 or 4 brushes, one light, medium, dark, and one for a highlight. The other 3 brushes I use is Series 93, Series 99, and Series 33. And here's the difference. 99 is very thin. Series 33, this is a short handle. I have them in long handle as well, is even throughout. Great for doing flowers, detail, stuff like that. But great for hair, middle tones, doing strands once you have it blocked in. And this would be a Series 93. So it's wide, and then it's a little pointed on the end. So I can go in and do these little details by the bangs or wherever I need them. The other place I use them is for very thin lines, although I tend to use a short flat for those, or one of these Eclipse short filberts. So I do the short flat, the short filbert. Let's see where my short flat is, right here. And that's a number 2. These are really great. So for any of the moon, the stars, the sparkle, these little very loose details, I don't overly paint. I block it in, and then I go in with a second layer, it's done. So when you move back, it will look very tight, but if you get up close, you'll see like brush strokes on there. I don't like when things look like a photograph. I kind of like when it has a little variety of both. So with the flat, this is what I use to get these lines in where the seams were in the clothing. Any of these short stars, I will use something like this. Sometimes I'll use it on the bridge of the nose. The edges of flowers really holds an edge. I love these. I'm a big fan of the Eclipse lines, so I use them a lot. And then I could go in with my Series 99, and I can then paint in more strands as it dries. I don't touch it if it's not dry, because then it will lift up, and then you're in trouble. For the face, I use Series 81, one of my favorite brushes. I was talking about it before, how it holds a lot of paint. This brush lasts forever. I have a whole can of these from a long time ago, and they really, this one's a number 10, I believe. It just holds its shape. And I use that for, you know, the zygomatic, the ball of the nose, the wings of the nose. The smaller ones I will use for the upper eyelid. Underneath the eyelid, I can just get the planes of that. Sometimes I use it for lips. It all depends on the size of the painting, like I said. Now, for when you lose a shape or a shadow shape or something like that, or you just want something to hold a lot of paint and have a sharp edge, I use the evergreens. These last forever. You can really beat them up, and sometimes I beat my brushes up because I tend to scrub a lot of times when I need to. Then sometimes I lay the paint on like I'm aware I'm scrubbing too much. No, you're gonna ruin your brush, don't do that. You know, a little voice in my head goes off. But this brush is pretty old. It's about 4 years old, and you know, I did all of the leaves with this brush. And then with the filbert, sometimes like in the dress areas, like the finishing areas where I want a sharper edge, I'll use that. Well, that covers some of the brushes I use and what I use them for. So let's go downstairs where my slop sink is, and I'll show you my third and final method for cleaning my brushes out. So the other way I talked about is using Gamsol, odorless mineral spirits, and I have a brush washer forever. It's the whole line brush washer. I believe this is about 15 or 18 years old, and this is what I use to clean my brushes out, and I changed the odorless mineral spirit in here at least every quarter, every 4 months. But I have 2 jars. I have one that's clean with Gamsol. It's like a baby jar. You could get that at any store. And what I usually do is I wash my brush out in the turp, and then I wash it out in the cleaner turpentine. In this instance, I'm just going to take the brush, and this is the Dome Sable Series 81. I love this brush as well. Great for second and third layer. See, so some of the pigments coming out. Let's get a couple of them. I have the Comer and the Ivory filbert here. And I find the Comers are really easy to clean out. So I'm going to go in with the turpentine. If you want to see, there. And with the Ivory filbert. I just move it back and forth along the grating. Wow, look at how much pigment is coming out of that. So when do I use this method with the turp? Well, a lot of my paintings, as I said previously, I use medium, sometimes a sand oil with rectified turpentine. I do have an air purifier in my house that sucks out all the fumes and cleans the air with a diffuser that's lavender and eucalyptus, and so that I am not breathing in the harmful fumes. By the way, you keep it on the floor because things move up. Somebody said that they had done it overhead. No, on the floor because everything travels up. Think of heat. Heat rises, same thing with fumes. So as you can see, it's starting to come out. I turn this around, try to get a cleaner spot, make sure I'm getting everything. All right. And as I said, I then go in with the linseed soap. I kind of double up on this just to make sure I'm getting all the pigment out of my brushes. Reason being is I want them to last a long time. Now, if you're using bristles, one thing a friend of mine recommended, Anthony White Chulis, shout out to him, he actually will clean the brushes and then get a thread and tie the thread not very tightly, but just tight enough to keep the brushes in place so that they don't fray. And when you go to use them, they are the same way as when they're wet. And you can see these. I sometimes do that to the Ivory filbert. There's been issues where people say that it frays. Well, if you clean it the right way and you clean it out, that won't happen, especially if you use the oil and you're not using any medium. Sometimes I use oleo gel, sometimes I'm using liquid. It all depends on the painting and what I need and the substrate I'm using. That is really important. I don't have one way because sometimes I'm using copper, sometimes I'm using aluminum, sometimes I'm gilding, sometimes it's a panel, sometimes it's on canvas. That all matters for me to get a certain effect that I want. So I don't follow the rule. Now, notice what I'm doing is I'm really squeezing out extra water. And then what I do is I lay them flat, not up. Close everything up here. And I'll show you a couple of brushes that I cleaned yesterday. I'm lucky that I have a slop sink in my house. If you don't, I would highly recommend, if you have a hookup in your basement, to do that. So here's a few brushes. This is Series 33. And Did the same thing to it. Sometimes I'll put like a little extra oil if I feel like they're coming apart. Now here's an ivory filbert that I cleaned yesterday with the oil and then the linseed soap. Here's the flat, and here's another filbert, and this is the Eclipse line, Series 33, ivory filbert, and I do have the ivory flats. Well, that concludes this session on how I use my rosemary brushes and how I clean my rosemary brushes. Very important if you want your brush to last a long time and not get the fraying edges in them. If you don't do that, well, then you're spending a lot of money. If you have any questions, please go to www.nancifrancevaz.com. Go to my contact page and message me any questions you have about this video. See you soon. Peace out.